is a massive tree in my yard that has been home to a pair of squirrels for several years. It seems that each year they produce a litter of squirrel pups that add to their extended family. A while ago, I noticed that one of the squirrels seemed to have acquired some type of condition. Huge chunks of fur were missing from its back and its neck. And I assumed this would be likely the demise of the squirrels and maybe squirrels in the rest of the neighborhood. So through a highly scientific Google search, I assumed that it turns out that they would be very ill. But it turns out that the mother, in the absence of being able to find nesting for her baby pups, actually removes the fur from her neck and her back to create a place that's safe and healthy for her pups. Fortunately for the mother squirrel, the hair grows back. And the young, well-developing squirrels move out in due time into successful, independent living. Now, you know where I'm going with this. Would it not be impressive if the only thing that parents of children with autism had to do was give up a bit of fur or hair in the short term in order to see their children and set them on a path to full participation in the tree branches of local communities? You already know much truth about what parents face in their role as caregivers throughout their lives. They never imagined that in addition to being parents, they'd have so many sleepless nights, sit on committees, deliver batches of cookies to meetings with professionals to reinforce them for listening to them, to speak with media about not only their amazing children, but also the daily challenges of being a caregiver. What we also know is that it's fear of society's response to them and their children that fuels the significant anxiety that drives their efforts. Caregivers are struggling to cope and often themselves taking medication for anxiety, depression, and more. Parents of older teens have only whispered that they've not been able to face the planning of realities of what will happen when their children exit high school and become adults. Dealing with one day at a time is often all that is possible. In a sobering 2014 article published by the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, the authors described the value of caregiver time in supporting Canadian children with autism on the spectrum and adults. They estimated that the lifetime value of just caregivers' time to support a severely impacted person with ASD to be about $5.5 million, beyond those of neurotypical person. And that figure represents 24-hour support, 7 days a week care with decreasing dollar amounts depending on the independence level of the individual. The authors also go on to state that this is the same as telling a family at the age of their child's diagnosis that they need to make a lump sum investment on that same day of $1.6 million, invested at 5%, to pay for the lifetime costs of care and support their loved one will need. And that doesn't include the money that they spend on all the other treatment programs and opportunities. Recently, a wise parent that I know had been scanning research posters and listening to presentations at an ASD conference, always hoping for some new nugget of research that would directly help parents and influence what would happen with treatment and treatment and opportunities for her own son. She became exasperated by the dozen or so posters and presentations whose repeated conclusions were that parents raising children on the spectrum were highly stressed. How many times or ways do you think it's necessary to research what we already know, she asked. She mused that maybe she should create a poster and in the large letters simply state, parents of children with autism are stressed because they live with constant stress. That's it, she said. Can we move on now with studies that demonstrate what actually makes things better for families? The unspoken assumption for the adults on the autism spectrum is that their parents will remain their caregiver, even into their 80s and 90s, for their adult children. As a community, we barely recognize this as an extraordinary savings to national coffers, but on the backs of caregivers. As the number of adults with ASD grows, our population demographics change, and we have many more aging and bone-tired caregivers who've foregone careers and any resulting investment in their own retirement. There will be serious societal impacts on the burden of care for both caregivers and their own aging issues, and on caring for loved ones with ASD. Disability tax credits and savings plans will help, but will not begin to cover the costs borne by families. But when we create seamless supports for people with autism across the lifespan, they thrive. But while we continue to advocate for those environments and supports, what if we also considered healthy caregivers as a fundamental component of those supports? If we intentionally focused on caregivers' health and did everything we could to help them be the best they can be to support their children, what would be the impact? It would dramatically change our advocacy dialogue if we didn't simply tack on the needs of caregivers onto the flip chart page we call the parking lot for future discussion. I believe it's time to elevate this conversation to action. Perhaps in response to parents' question of what will happen to their son and daughter with autism when they're gone, we might also answer the question of what is happening to parents while they are here. What would a support system look like that never pitted parents against one another in the quest for limited resources, or if we stopped asking families to describe their children in the most negative terms in order to access funding? What if we financially compensated caregivers in a way that had a positive impact on their own well-being, and that such a role was deemed vital to an inclusive society? And that there was one professional system navigator available to families throughout their and their children's lives? What if we reinforced every researcher who was considering a study on families to seek out answers and solutions about what actually decreases stress that caregivers and families experience, and to share that information with them, policymakers, and professionals who also support families? What if in our fundraising and advocacy efforts, we stopped describing people with autism as disordered, but instead as capable contributors at every age and stage of life when we create supportive environments in which they can thrive? I'm not a parent of a child with ASD. I'm not even a parent. But I know when we listen to caregivers of family members with autism about their own stories and what makes a difference to them and respond accordingly, the well-being of families improves. And finally, what would happen to families if they knew from the time that they wondered about the different way their child was developing that it wasn't a cause for excessive alarm? Because in Canada, you don't need to lose the fur off your back, because abundant supports and opportunities were already available to them and their children across both lifespans. Thank you.